And welcome to this week's video lecture for History 2316, Modern World History Online. So, this week's topic is sort of picking up right where we left off last week. We're still dealing with imperialism and Europe's push to colonize other territories of the world. Last week we looked at Europe's push to colonize Africa, which is happening from the Berlin Conference forward between 1884 and 1885. All the way into the early 20th century. This week we're going to be looking at colonialism in Asia. And what makes colonialism in Asia a lot different from colonialism in Africa is whereas we saw European powers splitting all of the African continent for the most part, sans Ethiopia and Liberia for their own reasons, what we're going to see is with Asia, more of this territory remains dominated by what we could call Asian governments. We're not going to see Europe be successful at colonizing all of the Asian continent, nor are they going to be successful in taking all of the islands that lie in the Indian and Pacific Ocean. So, when we're looking at some of these territories that are going to remain independent, for a time we have King China will remain independent. And King China picks up from the Ming Dynasty. And for a very long time, King China is ultimately going to be rejecting the presence of foreigners, trying to keep them in the coastal territories, not from spreading to the inland. In particular, much of the Chinese society was concerned with the idea that Christianity would undermine their traditional values and their traditional culture there. And wherever Europeans went, as we saw last week, Christianity tended to come with them. And so King China is going to make a push to remain independent throughout this period, and they'll be successful in that up until just about the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, and we'll talk about that at the end when we discuss the Boxer Rebellion. Also, what we're dealing with in Asia is the powerful empire of Russia. So Russia is one of those interesting sort of entities that hold a different place in world history. Russia is neither entirely Asian nor are they entirely European. The vast majority of the country's landmass, and even at the time period we're discussing, the late 1900s and early 20th century, most of that landmass is in Asia. And they're going to be occupying most of the territories that we would call Eastern Europe over to the Near East, and then what we would today call the modern Federation of Russia. So what we're really seeing with the Russians here is because they are engaged politically with the rest of Europe, culturally they're aligning more with Europe than they are with Asia. The ruling class is adopting a lot of tendencies from French culture, German culture, and British culture. Ultimately, the rest of the European nations are going to look at Russia as a European nation as well, despite the fact that much of the landmass, as I mentioned, is technically in Asia. So, all that it belongs to Russia during this time period, that's going to remain Russian. We don't see Europeans vying to take a lot of territory away from Russia. They will come into one conflict with the British, and it behooves us to turn our attention to that now, in as much as the British had gained a foothold in India in what we would call modern Pakistan. They administered all of this originally as part of what was known as the East India Company. They would go through and use, much like they did in Africa, a divide and conquer tactic, where they would align themselves with different rajas or kings of smaller kingdoms, these what you could call Hindu kingdoms that take up much of the forested region of India. What they do is they play one raja off of another. They were utilizing the fact that the Mughal Empire is collapsing under some popular revolts that are occurring in the area. And after the East India Company is able to consolidate their power there in India, it will become a formal colony. And as I said, the colony of British India is something that's going to occupy the landmass that we today would call India and Pakistan. So, what's interesting about this is if you look at the geography of all this, there's a region in between the borders of British India and the Russian Empire. And that's roughly corresponds with what we would call modern-day Afghanistan. The British and the Russians are going to get into a conflict over this. And this is something that happens throughout the entire 19th century for the most part. They're constantly battling over control of these tribal areas of Afghanistan. These areas are very difficult to take because you have to go and negotiate individual treaties with individual leaders and heads of households and villages and sort of communities. So it's a long, sort of drawn-out process, and Russia and Britain keep coming into these minor military skirmishes with each other. They're trying to outmaneuver each other politically. They're trying to intimidate one another militarily. And we call all of this collectively the Great Game. Now, this process is going to come to an end in 1895. That's when the British and the Russians sign what's known as the Entente Alliance. And what's interesting about this largely explains why Russia and Britain are going to fight on the same side in World War I when we get there. They come to an agreement that as long as Russia never threatens the borders of British India, they're free to take what they can take in Afghanistan, and Britain will leave that alone. And as a result of this, they form an alliance that guarantees mutual defense. That will become very important when war breaks out between Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Germany. That, as you might know, becomes the origins of World War I in about 15 years after this happens, 15 or 20 years. So that's sort of what we're looking at in that territory. The Russian Empire is expanding downwards and southwards. British India was trying to move upwards out of what we would call modern Pakistan. We also have to talk about another one of those big World War I players. That is the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire is retaining control during this time period, the late 1800s and the early 1900s, of an area that would roughly correspond with modern-day Turkey. The Ottoman Empire had been in existence since the 1300s, but it was slowly shrinking and collapsing. They'd been driven out of Eastern Europe by competition with the Russians. They were getting forced back from the Mediterranean. Greece had booted the Ottoman Empire by this point. And so the Ottoman Empire, when we encounter it during Asian colonialism, it's shrinking. It's coming what used to be very, very large land borders that went from Eastern Europe to North Africa all the way down to the Indus River Valley in India, have now been shrunk all the way into what we can pretty much say is modern-day Turkey, an area that they called Anatolia back in these days. So the next major area we need to talk about in terms of Asian colonialism is the area that we call the Kingdom of Siam and their relationship with the French. Ultimately, this whole territory will, by the end of the colonial period there, be reorganized into French Indochina. But the Kingdom of Siam is going to enter into conflict because France first invades the area that we would today call southern Vietnam. At that point in time, that was under the control of, or it was a tutelary state or a tributary state of the Qing Empire in China. And so ultimately, France is going to have to enter into what is known as the Franco-Sino Wars from 1884 to 1885. But their military victories over King China in this particular region means that they are going to acquire the territory that we would call southern Vietnam, northern Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But immediately to the west of that is the independent kingdom of Siam. Some of you who are familiar with musical theater might know this kingdom from The King and I. So France is going to move on to attack Siam, and they will enter into a conflict in 1893. Again, with a French victory within that conflict, they're going to acquire the territory that becomes Thailand. And so ultimately, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, when you look at them collectively, are being rolled into the French Empire at this point in time, and they're renamed French Indochina. Now, just like it was with the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, and all these empires building up into World War I, this is going to play a very important role down the line in world history as well. In the midst of the Cold War, the United States is going to take over this territory from France. France is booted out of French Indochina, and when military advisors from the United States come to try to help them maintain this colony, ultimately that will be what embroils the U.S. in the Vietnam War. So the other people we need to talk about that are players in this particular region are the Dutch. The Dutch have already, by the late 17 and early 1800s, consolidated their power. A lot like the British, they had an East India Company as well. Basically a crown company that was given the right to trade on behalf of the government, to establish treaty relationships on that behalf of the government. They had gone in and taken the area that we today would call Indonesia. And so they have been well established in this territory, and after the Berlin Conference, in 1884, 1885, they're no longer going to be facing a whole lot of competition from their European counterparts. Their claims to this territory of Indonesia are recognized. So, now that we've dealt with basically mainland Asia, that's all been sort of cut up in the ways we've just discussed, we need to talk about the Spanish-American War and the burgeoning American Empire. Now, historians for years have been arguing about whether what America did in the early 20th century constitutes true imperialism. There's a lot of discourse back and forth about it, but it does, behoove us to take a look at what's going on there. So the whole thing starts with the sinking of the USS Maine in 1898. This was a U.S. boat stationed in Havana Harbor in Cuba. Cuba is undergoing a nationalist movement. They're trying to kick the Spanish out of Cuba and become an independent nation. In the midst of the fighting between Spain and Cuba, this boat called the USS Maine is sunk in Havana Harbor. It explodes, and a number of American sailors and naval officers are killed. Due to this process that we call yellow journalism that's pushed forward by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, two very well-known journalists, they're going to go down and they're going to stoke American interest. And they're going to stoke American anger over what has happened here in Havana. And ultimately what this does is it leads Americans without any evidence whatsoever of whether or not the Spanish blew it up, or the Cubans blew it up, or even the boat just blew up due to some other accident. It could have hit a mine within the harbor. Some other people have said that a munitions chamber would blow up in the bottom of the ship. No one really knows to this day why the Maine sunk or what blew it up. But yellow journalism is going to point the finger directly at Spain. And so the United States is going to enter into a conflict in Cuba with Spain where the United States will start supporting nationalists there. And ultimately what that does is it leads to, first, the Spanish-American War, which ends rather quickly. And at that point, when Spain loses this war to the United States, it's mostly fought in Cuba and the Philippines, and to a much lesser degree, Guam. We'll talk about that in 1 second, because it's an interesting little side note of history. But basically, the United States achieves a victory in Cuba with their Cuban allies. And Cuba is granted independence, at least limited independence for a while, before the United States starts making moves on the Western Hemisphere, another subject we'll deal with. But then they go and fight Spain in the Philippines. And they partner up with Filipino nationalists to try and kick the Spanish out of this territory. So what ends up happening is with an American victory in the Spanish-American War of 1898 and 1899, we're ultimately going to see that Spain's overseas colonies, they're granted to the United States. So for the first time in its history, the United States would own overseas colonies and become an imperial country. So ultimately what we're seeing here is with Guam, there's an issue in which the American gunboats, naval ships, pull up into the harbor in Guam. And the Spanish governor comes running down from the fortification on the coast and he says, "Sorry, we couldn't give you the 21-gun salute that you deserve when you come into the harbor here. But the truth is, we don't have any munitions on the island." At which point the American naval commander says, "It's just as well because we're at war." You see, nobody ever bothered to tell the governor of Guam that the United States and Spain were at war. And so Guam is turned over without a fight. There is some harsh fighting in the Philippines, and the fighting will continue after Spain is kicked out of that territory. Filipino nationalists are unhappy. Basically, they fought a war of independence with Spain, and then the United States turned around and colonized them. So they're trying to get rid of one colonial power, and then the United States steps in and becomes a new colonial power. So obviously Filipinos are not pleased with this. That opens up into what we call the Philippine-American War, and the Americans will be successful in that warfare as well, and they will take the island of the Philippines as a formal colony. So this really begins the growing American push for influence around the globe. It's what puts America basically on level with European nations. But it's not just what's happening in Asia that makes America important in terms of being a global player at this point in time. It's also during the early 20th century that we see America trying to basically cement its influence economically and politically over the entire Western Hemisphere. So basically the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. What's going to happen here is that the United States never invades a nation and formally says, you belong to us now, you're our colony, we run things politically here. That's not what's going on. The United States is a little bit more underhanded in how they're going to extend their influence. First, there's a situation that erupts basically over some outstanding debts in which European nations are owed money by Latin American nations. So, the United States is going to put out what they call the Roosevelt Corollary, named after the current president in the early 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt. What this is, you've probably heard the expression before, speak softly and carry a big stick. This defines U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. What it says is, if there's a violation of international law, if a Latin American nation does something it's not supposed to do, it breaks a treaty, it breaks a trade negotiation, it doesn't pay up on a debt, then it is up to the United States to be the police force in the Western Hemisphere. And it all ties back to a document that's passed by President Monroe in 1823. What he basically says is, once European nations have been kicked out of Latin America, don't come back. If you do, you're going to be fighting with the United States, not just the nation you're trying to reclaim. And so the Roosevelt corollary, as most corollaries do, they have to go hand in hand with something. It goes right along with the Monroe Doctrine. And what it says is, if a European nation has a problem in Latin America, it's none of their business. It's the United States' business. And also what it does is it sends a message to Latin America. It's Teddy Roosevelt saying to Latin America, if you do not abide by international law, if you do not play ball with the United States politically, you are going to answer to our military. That's what it means to speak softly and carry a big stick. So the Roosevelt corollary is one of these things where basically he's making a very direct threat to Latin American nations. If you have a problem with the way that international law works, if you can't work out a problem yourself, we're not going to stand here and dictate to you what you need to do to get in line. You're going to screw up, and then we're going to bring the hammer down. That's the whole idea of the Roosevelt corollary. And through that policy, the United States is going to slowly start interfering in a lot of the events in the Western Hemisphere. So much so that for at least the first part of the 20th century, you could clearly make the argument that a lot of Latin America doesn't necessarily operate independently. They have to consider these sorts of policies. Another situation that sort of comes up right around 1914 is that the United States finishes construction of the Panama Canal. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with this, what it does is it's a man-made seaway. It's a canal that connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. Now, what that does is it takes a whole bunch of days off of a naval trip. You don't have to go down south around South America anymore to get from one ocean to the other. You can cut right through the middle of the Americas. However, because the United States finishes construction on it and it belongs to the United States, as does the territory on which it sits, ultimately what you're going to see is that if you're a Latin American nation who needs this for trade, needs this for military defense, you have to be able to move your navies around quickly. If you want to use it, you have to do what the United States tells you to do. And so ultimately you don't want to run afoul of the United States or you're going to be completely iced out of the Western Hemisphere's economy. So that's sort of the big picture that we're seeing globally now. We've seen Africa has been colonized by Europe. Southeast Asia and all of Asia has been sort of split up between either land-based Asian empires or overseas European empires. And the United States as well. The Western Hemisphere, although not formally colonized, is firmly under the control of the United States, just simply because of economic and political pressure that the U.S. is able to exert in those territories. Now, all is not well in the U.S., we know that, in terms of race relations in the early 20th century. And what I'm trying to do here is highlight that there is starting to be an awakening in global black consciousness. And we can see this through a core idea known as Pan-Africanism. The reason that I wanted to step forward and talk about that during this lecture is because it's espoused and sort of originated with a guy by the name of Marcus Garvey. He's a Jamaican immigrant who moves to Harlem in the United States in New York. And he organizes together this UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Fund. What this is all about is it's about African American self-sufficiency. This organization is going to give loans to black-owned businesses. They're going to make sure that people are spending their money within the community rather than going and spending it outside the community. And he believes that economic empowerment can strengthen the position of African Americans in the society. Because as we know, during this part of the early 20th century, we have Jim Crow laws in the South and legal segregation. And in the North, race relations aren't much better, and African Americans still are not treated as equal citizens. They're not given equal rights. And so ultimately what Garvey is going to come up with is this idea of Pan-Africanism. And he puts it into play right around 1914. And what it's basically saying, what Pan-Africanism is all about, is people of African descent, people within the African diaspora or in Africa, on the continent proper, are ultimately going to be subjected to the same sorts of prejudice, the same types of oppression. And so globally, they need to come together and work as one unit to fight back against this oppression. Basically, what he sees is white supremacy all over the globe. Whether if you're in Africa, as we know from last week's lecture, you're probably colonized by a white European nation. If you're in the United States, you're living as a second-class citizen, or you're living as almost a non-citizen in the American South, where your rights are violently being kept from you. In the Caribbean, things are not much better. There is a white political class, for the most part, who runs things, and an African descent laboring class. So what he says is whether you're from Jamaica, if you're from Queens in New York, or if you're from Nigeria, it really doesn't matter. You're facing the same type of oppression, and we all need to come together to fight back against it. And that ultimately leads to a notion that doesn't gain a whole lot of traction in the Western Hemisphere, but should still be discussed. When you have other black intellectuals in the Western Hemisphere talking about integration, political enfranchisement, and equal rights, Garvey says that's a pipe dream. None of that's ever going to come true. So long as we're living in a white-dominated society, we will never have equal rights. And so what Garvey is ultimately going to try and start is something called the Back to Africa movement. And here, the reason I bring this up is it's all about our class, world history, global connections. What he's saying is that we living in the Western Hemisphere, people of African descent, we will never get an equal shake. We will never be treated fairly, and the only place we can find true freedom is the continent of Africa. Now, he ultimately will be deported from the United States in 1923 on what a lot of people would call a sort of trumped-up, bogus mail fraud charge. He was very much a social agitator, so most people speculate that really the United States just wants to get him out because he's going to cause a lot of problems domestically. So Garvey, what he's ultimately going to do is head back to Jamaica and continue working on his plan about black self-sufficiency. But Back to Africa movement never really gains much traction because if you look at the African diaspora that's living in these territories, the United States, the Caribbean, Latin America, they don't know Africa. They weren't born in Africa. Their parents weren't born in Africa. They're many, many, many generations removed from Africa. And so it's not home to them. So for him to call this Back to Africa movement, that doesn't resonate with a lot of people in the New World because the only society they've ever known is the one they grew up in, the one they call home. So ultimately his Back to Africa movement's going to fail. However, Pan-Africanism is something that will persist into the future. And that's why I wanted to bring it up in this lecture while we're in this sort of time frame. Because after World War II, when Africa starts to decolonize and break away from European nations, what you're going to see is that they call upon Pan-Africanism as a concept that will help them reject European political structures and gain independence in the post-World War II era. So that's why that's ultimately important, and I include it in the lecture. Now, one last issue I want to talk about is the Boxer Rebellion. This has to do with King China. As I said at the outset of this video lecture, that King China is pretty much the inland areas, stands for a few coastal territories. They're closed off to foreigners, and they're largely closed off to foreign trade as well. This does not sit well with the French, it does not sit well with the British, or the Germans, or the Russians, or the Americans. China is a very rich trade market, and everybody wants to get access to it. And so we have a number of Europeans are living in these coastal territories, these areas called the legation quarters. This is ultimately going to become a hotspot of the Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxers are a group of people who at the end of the 19th century feel that Christianity and foreign influence is corrupting and ruining King China. So they start leading these revolts in the countryside, trying to attack any Chinese people who have converted to Christianity, and they're ultimately making their way towards the coastal territories to start attacking foreigners in these quarters on the coast. So the Empress of King China, Empress Dowager, is going to ultimately support the Boxers. And the response that these Western nations, America and the European nations, what they're going to do is they're ultimately going to form an 8-nation alliance. They allied together to fight back the Chinese threat, and they're ultimately successful. The foreign powers there are successful at crushing out the Boxer Rebellion. And what that does is it puts King China in a position where they can no longer resist foreign influence. Due to the treaties that are being signed to end this war, in order to even leave any semblance of the king power structure in place, they had to sign a lot of treaties that basically gave all the power over to the European nations in that territory. The European nations from that point forward are going to pretty much agree on something called the open door policy. Nobody formally colonizes China. Everybody has access to free trade there. And really the only people who don't have a say in this at all is China, ironically. And so ultimately what we're going to see is that despite the fact that King China was able to remain independent until right about the 20th century, just short of it, the Boxer Rebellion will give the Western nations the impetus or the justification it needs to bring King China to its knees and force it open to foreigners. So that's basically giving you an idea of what the world's looking like in the colonial period. And the reason that this is really important is in the 20th century, as you probably well know, we're going to end up in two major global conflicts, ones that very few people in the world are actually going to be able to escape. And the reason for that is colonialism. It's imperialism. Most of the globe is under the direction or the political control of some other nation, of a handful of nations from Europe. So what starts as a small territorial nationalist dispute in Central Europe there, right on the borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and what we would today call basically Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. These are going to be the jumping off points for World War I. A very localized conflict there becomes this huge issue on a global scale where everybody gets embroiled and everybody is losing people in the fight. And ultimately that has everything to do with the fact that if Britain gets involved in World War I, that means all of its territorial holdings in Africa get involved. That means British India gets involved. If the United States is going to get involved, that means the Philippines will be sending troops. Cuba will be sending troops. Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, who puts itself under a protectorate with the United States during this time period. Same thing with France. And then on the other side, you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Doesn't really have any overseas territories, but Germany does. So when Germany gets involved, we're going to see soldiers from Tanzania, or what they call Tanganyika. You're going to see soldiers called from Benin and Togo and Cameroon. You're going to see it brought from the Marianas Islands and some of these territories that they hold, which I didn't really mention because there's not a great deal of people living on them. They're mostly military strategic outposts. But really the Germans are going to be calling upon their overseas colonies to fight. The Italians will be calling on the limited holdings they have in North Africa to fight in these global wars, as do the British and the French. And so really colonialism and the map that we've sort of laid out in these last two lectures really helped to explain how what looked like localized conflicts become global conflicts. So, thanks for tuning in. Hope you learned something from this, and as usual, if you have any questions, concerns, or comments, feel free to let me know and get in touch. Have a good one.